The genetic counselor's pen stopped moving mid-sentence. She looked up at me, then back at her screen, then at me again. Her face did something I couldn't read. Not quite alarm, not quite pity. Something in between that made my stomach drop before she'd said a single word. "Mims Whitfield," she said carefully, "I need to ask you a few questions before we continue. I'd come in that Tuesday morning the same way anyone comes in for a routine appointment, slightly late, slightly under-caffeinated, wearing the same gray cardigan I'd had since university. I was there because my aunt on my mother's side had just been diagnosed with BRCA2. My GP said it was worth screening. I figured it would take 40 minutes tops, and I'd still make it back to the school before second period. I was a grade 4 teacher. I had 22 kids waiting on me to finish a unit on frogs. I was not prepared for what came next. Your sample came back with some flags," the counselor said. Her name was Dr. Arsenault. Not the name from my file, the real Dr. Arsenault, the one who'd reviewed my results personally instead of sending a technician. That should have been my first sign. "There's no BRCA variant present, which is good news." She paused. "But the ancestry markers we run alongside the panel, they don't match the family history you submitted." I laughed. Actually laughed. "What does that mean?" "It means," she said, setting her pen down completely, "that your biological profile is inconsistent with both your maternal and paternal lineage as recorded, on either side." The room got very quiet. Outside, someone was running a floor polisher in the hallway. I remember that, the low drone of it, completely indifferent to what was happening to me through the wall. "I don't understand," I said, "Ms. Whitfield." She folded her hands. "Have you ever had reason to believe you might be adopted?" I was 31 years old. I had my mother's nose. Everyone said so. I had my father's stubbornness. He said so himself, usually when we were arguing. I had a baby photo where I'm sitting on my grandmother's lap in Sudbury, and she's looking at me like I hung the moon. I was not adopted. I was not a mystery. I was just a person who'd come in to get a blood test so I could stop worrying about cancer. "No," I said. "Absolutely not." Dr. Arsenault didn't argue with me. She just looked at me with that careful, measured expression and said she'd like to refer me to a colleague who specialized in situations like this. She said it so gently, like she was telling me a patient had died, like she already knew something I didn't. I drove home on autopilot. I sat in my car in the parking lot of my apartment building for 20 minutes without going inside. I called my mother. She didn't pick up. My mother and I had never had an easy relationship. I want to be fair about that. She wasn't cruel, not the way you read about in those stories where the step-parent burns cigarettes on arms or locks kids in closets. Nothing like that. She was cold. Efficiently, consistently cold in the way that some people are when they find the presence of their own child inconvenient. I grew up in a small house in Barrie, Ontario. My father worked in logistics, long hours, often away. My mother worked part-time at a dental office and spent the rest of her time doing things that didn't involve me. Her book club, her garden, her sister's family 3 streets over. Her sister had 2 daughters my age who she adored openly. She bought them things without being asked. She remembered their school play dates. She remembered mine too, technically, but there was always this distance, like I was a task she was completing rather than a person she wanted to be around. When I was 9, I overheard her on the phone with her sister. I wasn't supposed to be listening. I was on the stairs and the kitchen was just below, and she said something I have never stopped hearing in the back of my head. "It's just hard," she said. "You know how it is with her. It's always been hard." Her sister said something I couldn't make out. "I know," my mother said. "I know, but it doesn't feel natural. It never has." I told myself I'd misunderstood. I told myself that for 22 years. I got good at it. My father called me back that evening, not my mother. My father, from a layover in Calgary, sounding tired and distracted, and when I told him what the counselor had said, there was a silence on the line that lasted just a beat too long. "Dad, sweetheart, Dad, can you come home this weekend? I'll be back Friday night. Can you come home? Tell me right now." Another silence, the sound of an airport announcement somewhere behind him, and then, very quietly, "I'll explain everything when I see you. I promise. Just please don't call your mother yet." That was the sentence that broke something open in me, not the genetic test, not the counselor's careful face. That sentence, "Please don't call your mother yet," as if she were a third party, As if she were someone separate from the situation, someone who needed to be managed. As if she'd always been separate. I drove to Barrie on Friday. The whole 401 North, 2 hours of November highway, bare trees and gray sky and transport trucks, and I kept replaying every memory I had of my childhood, trying to find the seams. Trying to find the place where something didn't fit. There were more of them than I'd expected. My father met me at the door. He looked old. He'd looked old for a while, but that evening he looked like the weight of something specifics was sitting on him. He'd made dinner. Pasta, the same thing he always made when he didn't know what else to do, and we sat down at the kitchen table and he didn't eat any of it. My mother was in the living room. She didn't come to the table. Your mother and I, my father started, and then stopped. Tried again. We had a very difficult time early on, in our marriage. We wanted children. It wasn't happening. He looked at his fork. We were on a waiting list, for adoption, private agency here in Ontario, but the wait was long, and your mother, she was struggling, and then we got a call. I waited. It wasn't through the agency, he said. It was through someone your mother knew, a woman she'd gone to school with. She said there was a baby, a little girl, that the family was in crisis and couldn't keep her, and that if we wanted to, we could take her home. His voice dropped. No paperwork, no agency. Just, a woman handed us a baby in a hospital parking lot in Mississauga and told us her name was Claire. Claire, I repeated. We named you Faye, he said. We didn't. We thought it was cleaner. A fresh start. I put my fork down. Dad, that's not adoption. That's not how adoption works. He nodded, not looking at me. Dad, that's kidnapping. That's a child being handed off without legal process to strangers. We didn't know, and his voice cracked in a way I hadn't heard since my grandmother's funeral. We didn't ask the questions we should have asked. We wanted a baby so badly, and she was right there, and she was so small, and he pressed his hand over his mouth. I've lived with it, Faye, every day. I've lived with it. What happened to the family? I said. The real family. He shook his head. I don't know. I've never known. Your mother, she had more contact with the woman who arranged it. But after a year, that woman moved away, and we moved forward. We tried to be your family. I tried. I swear to you that I tried. From the living room, the television volume went up. I left that night. I couldn't stay. I drove back down the 401 in the dark, and I sat with it. Really sat with it, the way you can't when you're in the room with the people who caused it. I was not Faye Whitfield. Or I was technically, in every document that mattered, in every file, in the school board database that had paid my salary for 6 years. But before that, before the parking lot in Mississauga, I had been someone else. I had been Claire. A family somewhere had called me Claire and then lost me, and for 31 years they had not known where I was. The thought was so enormous, I had to pull off at a rest stop and just breathe for a while. I called my best friend. We'd been close since teachers' college, the kind of friend who answers at 11 p.m. without complaint, and I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I have always loved about her. When I was done, she said, "Okay, so what do you want to do?" "I want to find them," I said. "My actual family." "Then that's what we do," she said, "starting tomorrow." I hired a lawyer first, a woman in Toronto who'd been recommended through a legal aid referral as someone who handled unusual family law situations. She was small and precise, and she wore reading glasses on a chain, and she did not seem remotely surprised by anything I told her, which was either reassuring or alarming. I still haven't decided which. "This is more common than people think," she said, making notes on a yellow legal pad. "Informal adoptions, gray market placements, particularly in the late 80s and early 90s, before tighter regulations came in. What you're describing, a private arrangement, no court involvement, no documentation, that's technically a violation of the Child and Family Services Act as it existed at the time." She looked up at me over her glasses. "It's also potentially a criminal matter. Kidnapping," I said. "Possibly," she said carefully. "Depends on the circumstances of how you came to be separated from your birth family in the first place. If they relinquished you voluntarily through this intermediary, it's one kind of case. If you were taken without their knowledge or consent." She paused. "That's another kind entirely. She helped me file with the Ontario Adoption Disclosure Register and also flagged my file with the RCMP's National Centre for Missing Persons and Unidentified Remains. The NCMPR, I hadn't even known that existed." She told me that families of children missing before the age of 5 were often in that database. She told me not to get my hopes up, but also not to lose them. 3 weeks later, someone at the RCMP called me back. I took the call in the parking lot of the school during my lunch break. I remember a group of kids from grade 6 were playing basketball on the outside court, and they were very loud, and I kept pressing my phone harder against my ear trying to hear. The officer's name was Sergeant Houle. She had a calm, professional voice, and she said the words I had been waiting to hear and dreading in equal measure. We may have a match. There's a family in Québec City who reported a missing infant daughter in November 1993. The details align with what we have from your lawyer's filing. I'd like to arrange a conversation. November 1993. I was born in September 1993. I did the math without meaning to. How did she go missing? I asked. The baby. A pause. That information is part of an open file, Sergeant Houle said carefully. But I can tell you that the family has never stopped looking. The family's name was Beaumont. Not Beaumont, anything. Just Beaumont, an old Quebec family from a neighborhood in Quebec City called Limoilou, the kind of neighborhood where families have lived in the same houses for 3 generations. My birth father, Gerard, had retired the previous year from a career in municipal engineering. My birth mother, Therese, taught piano out of their home. They had 2 other children, a son, 34, who worked as an architect in Montreal, and a daughter, 28, who was still in Quebec City doing her residency in pediatric medicine. They had a daughter who was supposed to be 31. The first call was a video call arranged through Sergeant Houle's office with a family liaison present on both ends. I sat in my lawyer's boardroom in Toronto, and the Beaumonts sat in what I could see was their living room. A warm, somewhat cluttered room with a piano visible in the background and family photographs covering an entire wall. My birth mother was pressing both hands flat on her knees like she needed something to hold on to. My birth father had the same eye color as me. I'd never seen that before. I'd never looked at another person and seen my own eyes looking back. Neither of us said anything for a long moment. Then she said, in accented English, "We have looked for you for so long." And that was the sentence that unmade me. The story of how I'd disappeared, the story I'd been missing for 31 years, came out in pieces over weeks, through conversations with my birth parents and through documents Sergeant Houle shared as the investigation developed. My birth mother had gone into early labor alone, my birth father out of town for work, and had driven herself to a hospital in Mississauga where she'd been visiting her cousin. She delivered me there, early, small but healthy, and spent 2 days in the hospital recovering. During those 2 days, a woman on the maternity ward, a woman who worked there, who had access, who knew which babies were with which mothers, had taken me during a night shift, walked out with me, told the nursing staff I'd been transferred for monitoring, and then simply didn't come back. By the time my birth mother raised the alarm, the woman was gone. I was gone. The hospital's records from that unit had a gap that was never satisfactorily explained. The RCMP investigation at the time had stalled. My birth family had kept the file open for 31 years, hiring private investigators, checking in with the NCMP every few years, never closing the door. The woman who'd taken me, the same woman who'd arranged my transfer to my parents in that Mississauga parking lot, had a name in the hospital records. She'd worked there for 8 months under a false identity. Her real name, when it was finally found, was someone with a history of what investigators called child procurement, connecting desperate couples with infants through means that didn't involve anything legal. She'd done it before. Possibly after. She had died in 2019. She would never answer for it, but there were others who would. My father, Dennis Whitfield, the man who'd raised me, came forward voluntarily once I'd retained my lawyer and the investigation was formally underway. I hadn't asked him to. He just showed up at the RCMP detachment in Barrie one morning and asked to make a statement. His lawyer told my lawyer afterward that he hadn't been able to sleep since the night I'd left, that he'd been carrying it since 1993 and couldn't carry it anymore. My mother was a different story. She had known more than my father, it turned out. She had stayed in contact with the woman who arranged the transfer for longer than she'd told my father. She had known there were questions about where I'd come from. She had chosen not to ask them, and then she had chosen not to answer them. For 31 years, while somewhere in Quebec City, two people were putting up posters and calling investigators, and not sleeping and not stopping. When RCMP officers came to the house to interview her, she told them she didn't remember the details. She said it had been a long time. She said she'd believed everything was handled properly. My lawyer had a different word for it, so did the Crown. The preliminary hearing was in February, in an Ontario court on a grey Wednesday morning that smelled like salt and wet boots. I sat in the gallery. I had not seen my mother since the night I'd left Barrie. She walked in with her lawyer and she looked smaller than I remembered, or maybe I was just seeing her differently now. Not as a mother, not even as the woman who'd made me feel like an inconvenience for 31 years, but as someone who'd made a choice and spent 3 decades not correcting it. She looked at me once, just once, quickly and then away. Her lawyer tried several angles: the passage of time, the absence of criminal intent on her part, the fact that she hadn't taken me, that she'd received me, which was different, legally speaking, which was the argument that hinged on whether what had happened to me was categorized as trafficking in persons or as receiving a child known to have been unlawfully removed. My lawyer, still small, still precise, still with the reading glasses on the chain, stood up and said something I will remember for the rest of my life. She said, "The passage of time is not a defense for the family who spent that time looking. 31 years is not an abstraction. It is 31 years of Christmases and birthdays and phone calls and private investigators and hope and loss. The question before this court is not whether time has passed. It is whether justice should." The courtroom was very quiet after that. While the legal process moved forward, slowly, the way legal processes always move, I drove to Quebec City in March. I went on a Thursday. I had a substitute lined up for my class. I wore the gray cardigan again, the one from university, because I wanted something familiar on my body for what was about to happen. My birth parents met me at the door of the house in Limoilou. It was a semi-detached house with a dark green door and window boxes that weren't planted yet because it was still too cold. My birth mother came down the front steps before I'd even made it to the walkway. She walked fast. She was a small woman with short, dark hair going silver, and she walked toward me like she was afraid I might change my mind and leave. She put her arms around me in the middle of the front path and she held on, and I'd been bracing myself. I'd been telling myself to be measured, to be careful, to not expect too much. I just completely fell apart. Right there in the cold March air, in front of a house I'd never seen. I cried in a way I hadn't cried since I was small. The kind of crying that doesn't feel like sadness exactly, but like something finally coming loose that should have come loose a long time ago. My birth father stood at the top of the steps, and he was crying too, not trying to hide it. He was a tall man with big hands, and he just stood there with his hands at his sides and tears running down his face into his beard. Inside, the piano was uncovered. There were photographs on the wall. My siblings at various ages, my birth parents young and then older, and one photograph in a frame that was slightly different from the others, slightly more carefully placed. That was just a hospital photo of a newborn. A hospital photo that had been there on that wall for 31 years waiting for the person in it to come home. My biological brother drove up from Montreal that weekend. He was tall like our father and loud in a way that was immediately warm rather than overwhelming. He brought his wife and their 2 daughters, who were 4 and 6 and completely indifferent to the emotional weight of the weekend in the way that only small children can be, which was exactly what everyone needed. He gave me a hug that lasted a while and then held me by the shoulders and looked at my face carefully and said, "You have Grandmamon's mouth." We always thought that photo looked like Grandmamon. His wife showed me the family group chat on her phone, which had apparently been an ongoing cascade of exclamation marks and photographs since the call from Sergeant Houle. My biological sister called from the hospital. She was on call. She couldn't get away. She was so sorry, and we talked for 40 minutes in my birth parents' kitchen, while my birth mother pretended not to listen from the next rooms. She had my same slightly flat affect when she was nervous, the way of getting very precise and factual when things felt too big. We figured that out about each other almost immediately. She said, "I've wanted a sister my whole life. I have so many questions." "Me too," I said. "Me too." The criminal proceedings wrapped up the following autumn. My mother, and I use that word now with more precision than before, meaning the woman who raised me, pleaded guilty to a single charge under the criminal code, receiving a child knowing them to have been unlawfully taken. Her lawyer had negotiated. The Crown accepted. She received a conditional sentence, house arrest, community service, a period of probation, no prison time. My lawyer was honest with me about that ahead of the ruling. Given her age, given that she hadn't been the one to take me, given 31 years of what her lawyer called a functioning family life, the court was unlikely to impose incarceration. It wasn't the outcome I'd imagined when I was sitting in the genetic counselor's office, not breathing while she looked at her screen. But my lawyer said something that helped me hold on to it. What this verdict means is that what happened to you is on the record. Officially, permanently, in language that does not equivocate. That matters. That's not nothing. My father pleaded guilty to the same charge. He received a similar sentence. He had cooperated fully. The court noted that. Afterward, he wrote me a letter. Handwritten, 4 pages, the careful print of someone who doesn't write by hand very often. He said he was sorry in ways that language couldn't hold. He said that loving me had been the realest thing he'd done, and that he understood if I couldn't hold both of those things at once, the love and what they'd done. He said he didn't expect anything, he just needed me to know. I read that letter 4 times. I haven't decided yet what to do with it. I think that's okay. I think some things take longer than a court schedule. My birth parents filed a civil suit against the hospital where I was born, where the woman had worked, where the systems had failed, where a baby had been walked out the door without adequate safeguards. That case was still in progress was eingestellt since. It moved slowly, the way civil cases do, but it moved, and my birth family established something with part of the settlement funds they received from an early mediation. A fund connected to the NCMPUR, specifically aimed at keeping cold cases of missing children active, at funding the kind of continued investigation that had, 31 years later, been the reason someone finally looked twice at a flag in a genetic database. They named it after the date the police file was first opened. November 1993. I still teach grade 4. I'm back in my classroom with my 22 kids, different kids now, a different year, but the same frog unit, the same gray cardigan, more or less the same life on the surface of things. My apartment is the same apartment. My best friend still answers the phone at 11 p.m. I still take the 401 home for holidays, except now, home means something I have to think about for a second before I answer, because there are 2 answers and both of them are real. I drive to Québec City 4 or 5 times a year now. My birth mother is teaching me piano very slowly with significant patience on her part. My birth sister and I text daily. My birth brother sends me voice memos instead of texts because he talks too fast to type, and they're always too long, and I listen to all of them twice. Last Christmas was the first Christmas I spent in the house in Limoilou. My birth mother made tourtière from her grandmother's recipe. My birth father fell asleep in his chair after dinner, and my biological nieces drew on his hands with washable markers while he slept, and my birth sister and I watched from the kitchen doorway and didn't say anything for a while. I thought about the photograph on the wall, the hospital photo of a newborn that had waited there for 31 years. I thought about Dr. Arsenal's pen stopping mid-sentence and how I'd laughed, actually laughed, because I was sure there'd been some mistake. There had been a mistake, just not the one I'd thought. And in the end, for all the grief of it, for all the years and the questions and the things that can't be returned and the things that can't be undone, in the end, the mistake had found its way back to where it was supposed to be. So had I.